Hey there, and welcome to this episode of Speaking of. This is actually a special episode because I'm fusing together two of my videos, which are Speaking of and the Cutting Room Floor, and I'm going to kind of do two in one here. Speaking of is the video segment where I examine a contemporary issue or topic and try to look at it through a Christian lens and try to evaluate what a particular social issue or political concern might look like when we look at it and try to evaluate through a Christian lens. And then the cutting room floor is where we look at something that maybe we just couldn't get into a message here at Sunny Slope. So it's a little bit like a leftover sermon content. And since last Sunday was Palm Sunday, one of the themes that I looked at was the theme of Christian nationalism. And that kind of straddles both of these video channels. That is an issue that is becoming increasingly talked about in Christian circles and in the public arena. And it's also something that was obviously in the sermon from Sunday. And so I thought it would be kind of maybe helpful and interesting to delve into that just a little bit more and to try to unpack a little bit more what Christian nationalism is and isn't, and what its impact is on the public arena, and then how do we as Christians view this whole uh, thread in our culture, this whole movement of Christian nationalism. Now, I want to begin by emphasizing something that I did say in last Sunday's message, and that is that Christian nationalism is not automatically equated with conservative uh, political ideology or even conservative theology. And sometimes they all get kind of lumped together. And neither is Christian nationalism the same thing as patriotism. In other words, you can love your country and yet reject Christian nationalism. You can have a place of you can be patriotic and yet recognize that Christian nationalism is something other than love for country, and thus you can then reject that. So Christian nationalism is not that. But we can't obviously define something by saying just what it isn't. I think it's also helpful to say what is Christian nationalism? What are we talking about when we use that term? And it turns out that it's actually a little harder to define than you might expect. I think the best way to look at it is to see that Christian nationalism is what happens when you fuse together Christian identity and American identity. So when Christianity becomes fused with your national identity, and particularly in our context, of course, it would be American identity. So that the American ideology, the American way of life becomes synonymous with Christianity. Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead have done they're sociologists, and they've done some research into this whole topic. They've done some digging into what is this movement in American public life today? What does it look like? And they're very, very nuanced in their study. And they point out that there's at least a couple of things that are consistently true with American nationalism. First is this idea of the fusion between American identity and Christianity, so that a person would be considered a Christian nationalist if, for example, they believe that to be a real, true, authentic, genuine American, you have to be a Christian and maybe white and conservative in your politics. In other words, you have to be on the conservative political spectrum, and and you have to be a professing Christian. Um, that's what it means to be American. In other words, to be American is to be Christian, and if you are not a Christian, then you're probably not true red-blooded American. And if that's the approach that a person takes, then there's becomes the sort of the next logical step becomes this desire to really enshrine in public life American values, American beliefs, American the or pardon me, I got that backwards. What happens is you want to enshrine in public life Christian values, Christian morality, and Christian tradition and beliefs. And that may or may not take on the approach of trying to make it law, like you want to try to enshrine Christian morality as the law of the land, or it may just be getting back to Christian traditions and making America a Christian nation again. It can often be seen when you hear people say, well, America is a Christian nation. And of course that's a whole other topic, because that can mean a lot of different things. But sometimes what people mean is that we have to really ensure that the United States is fully a Christian people once again. And if you're not Christian, then you're really not a full-blooded American. So that's one of these qualities that Whitehead and Perry talk about when it comes to Christian nationalism. The other sort of telling sign is the language of and the idea of America being in a sort of covenantal relationship with God. In other words, it's the belief and the conviction that America is a nation chosen by God, specially appointed by God for a special purpose in this world. And so a lot of times what you hear is people use language that in the Bible would have been attributed to Old Testament Israel, and Old Testament Israel becomes it becomes sort of America becomes the new Israel. America becomes the new chosen nation by God. And we have a responsibility then as a nation to live in a covenantal relationship with God. And the mindset becomes we have to turn back to God. We as a nation have to become a Christian nation again and be faithful in order that God will bless us once again. So I'm going to put up a quote here. And this quote, I think, I think the first thing to know is that this, oops, this quote reflects a sort of, it reflects kind of a sardonic or satirical approach, but it does capture well what Christian nationalism is all about. This quote is from Christopher Gordon, and he's writing in a piece called An American Nationalist Dream. And he's sort of writing from the perspective, he's not a Christian nationalist, but he's writing from the perspective of one, and he's capturing what it might sound like. And he says this: I'm tired of an effeminate culture. Men are weak, and Christians today are compromised on almost every single issue. They've adopted the social agenda of the political left, and the country is going to hell in a handbasket for it. We, that is Christians, have been demonized by the culture for far too long. And who are these infidels to take down God's country? It's not their country, it's mine. It's Jesus. So it's time to reclaim it for Christ. Now you hear a number of those different these different qualities that I've kind of described, that Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead described. First of all, it's the idea that to be a full red-blooded American, you've got to reject the political left, right? So we've said that Christian nationalism often believes that it often buys into conservative politics and conservative thinking, and anything that challenges that is seen as not just a different point of view, but actually it's to be rejected as demonic, right? And so hence the country's going to hell in a handbasket for it. The other thing is the label of infidels, like those who disagree on the question of on public policy and things. Those who challenge the view held by Christian nationalists are demonized not just as people you disagree with, and not even just people that you strongly disagree with, but they're given labels like infidels, and they're labeled traitors to the country. Again, the language of God's country. It's not their country, it's mine, it's Jesus' country, and so it's time to reclaim it for Christ. That reflects some of that covenantal language that suggests that America is God's nation, God's people. God has a special purpose for her, and thus anyone who opposes that is seen as traitorous and as a threat to American identity and even to Christian identity. So that captures well, I think, what Christian nationalism is as a definition. I think one of the ways, people don't obviously come right out necessarily and identify themselves as such, although maybe sometimes they do. There are a couple of I think symbols that maybe you might be able to, or a couple of ways to identify, maybe call them symptoms, and that is let me put up a different picture here. One of those symbols is this. When you get the mixture of Christian symbolism and political symbolism in the same space, that can often be a sign or a symptom. And so you get political rallies, and I'm showing you on the screen here, seen from the Capitol riot in January 6th of 2021. And you'll notice here that one of the things that came out, one of the things that was seen is Jesus, a picture of Jesus wearing a MAGA hat, "Make America Great" hat, again, synonymous with the Trump movement. And so there's that fusion of Christian ideology, Christian belief, as well as political imagery and political language. Another picture here I'll pull up is this one, "Jesus Saves." And you can see that it's in the midst of a whole lot of other political banners and political symbols. You've got Trump flags waving. Most of them are Trump, but also some American flags in there as well. And then in the midst of it, "Jesus Saves." Now, at the risk of reading too much into this, it seems that this person, because there were actually other signs that read at the rally that were seen, Jesus 2020, as though Jesus should be the political candidate. There were things, there were crosses that were seen throughout, and so you get this fusion of religious and political symbolism and imagery that come together. And again, that reflects that melding of political and religious identity and religious ideology, so that Christian nationalism reflects this idea that what can save us is ultimately either politics or Jesus, and probably some mixture of both. And so you kind of get this weird, bizarre mixture. But I think also it's worth noting that the opposite can be true as well. In other words, you can get political symbolism in a Christian setting. And so every year around like Memorial Day or 4th of July, sometimes this can come out where churches may want to put flags in the sanctuary, or they want to sing "God Bless America" as part of the worship service. And I think that gets actually that's a in my opinion, my perspective, that's a dangerous road to go down, because it actually sends the message that national identity and Christian identity are very close to one and the same. Now, again, I want to emphasize there, of course, it's appropriate to for Christians to appreciate and to be thankful for the country in which they live. We do enjoy many freedoms in the United States that many other places just don't enjoy. So there's nothing wrong with that, but I think it can go down a very risky road when you start to meld together religious and political imagery into one, either in a church setting where you have political and national symbolism, or at a political rally when you have spiritual imagery. The other, so those are a couple of symptoms. There's maybe one more symptom, and that is when you see Old Testament language, the language of Israel being a chosen nation, Israel being chosen by God, having God blessing the nations through one nation, that sort of thing. When that is applied to the United States, I think more often than not, that is a misapplication of biblical text and of the biblical narrative. And more often that's used, in at least in an American setting, to support this Christian nationalism that is not, in my judgment, is not faithful to the biblical narratives. And so anytime you get language that applied to Israel and it's just automatically applied to the United States, to me, that's something to be really, really cautious about. Now, like most movements, Christian nationalism is it's nuanced. And again, Whitehead and Perry did some in-depth study on this. They actually did some pretty good study on the demographics of who is it that makes up Christian nationalists, who supports it, who's drawn to it, what is the movement all about. And what they found is that actually, contrary to the stereotype, political conservatism does not equal people of a white racial background. In other words, the stereotype sometimes goes that it's white people who tend to be most politically conservative, and non-white people tend to be socially progressive and politically progressive and liberal. And in fact, they found that not to be true. They found that actually, in many cases, people of varying ethnic backgrounds and racial backgrounds, particularly Hispanic cultures and Asian cultures, tend to be more politically and socially conservative. And so like most of the time, the reality is really quite different. The reality that white people are only conservative and everybody else is progressive, it just is not supported. And the other thing that they found is that there are many people who identify as Christian. They identify even as evangelical Christian, and there's a term again that it really depends on how do you exactly define that. But in any case, those who identify themselves as evangelical actually reject Christian nationalism. And that's important because again, they often get lumped together so that the common narrative goes that if you are professing evangelical, then it must mean that you are in support of, or at least sympathetic to, Christian nationalism. And the data does not support that. Indeed, many who are Christian nationalists also identify as evangelical Christian, but it's far from a homogenous thing. In fact, what Perry and Whitehead found is that the people who move more and more towards the Christian nationalist movement also report that they do less and less of the traditional Christian disciplines like scripture, prayer, and public worship. And so what that means and what that suggests is that people who identify as Christian nationalists often they name themselves as evangelical, and yet they often do not really take seriously their practice of the Christian faith. They sort of are, they're more like cultural Christians. They identify as Christians, but church attendance might be very sparse. Personal Bible reading, personal prayer might be fairly inconsistent. And then they also found that the opposite is true, which means that as people took the disciplines of Christian living more seriously, as they spent time in prayer and in public worship and reading scripture, and they actually moved away from the ideology typically represented by Christian nationalism. So when you survey people about their beliefs and their convictions, those who took seriously scripture reading and other disciplines, they were less consistent with what Christian nationalism is all about. In fact, it was interesting. They found that many people, the more devoted they were to scripture, the more devoted they were to prayer and church attendance and so on. It was interesting. They actually began to fit in with both certain things of political, social and political conservatism and political and social, more liberal perspectives, which is to say, they became more supportive of the traditional view of marriage between man and woman, one man and one woman, and they became increasingly supportive in caring for the poor, which, if you want to be really, really stereotypical, traditional Christian values fall into the camp typically of those who are socially conservative. Care for the poor tends to fall towards those who are socially more on the liberal end of the spectrum. And what they found out was that as people devoted themselves more to scripture, prayer, Bible study, they became more, as a generality, they became more aligned with a traditional sexual ethic, and they became more aligned with caring for the poor, which again doesn't really fit the dominant narrative. So it was sort of an interesting trend that they noticed. Now, what does all this mean? A couple questions, I think, first of all, to ask yourself, maybe just by way of self-reflection. The first is this: do you judge your own country, and in this case, we're generally talking about the United States, do you view it as superior in God's eyes to other countries? In other words, do you hold to the perspective that your country is that God sees your country, i.e., the United States, as superior or better than other countries? And if that's the case, on what scriptural basis do you make that claim? How do you reconcile that with the passages in scripture in which God is the God of the nations, the God who desires to reach all the nations? And how do you reconcile that with the idea that as you go through Old Testament, from one nation to one person, i.e., Jesus, and all who are in Jesus are then called spiritual Israel? So how do you support this view biblically, that God sees the United States as superior to other countries? That's the first question, and you can sense where I'm going with that, which is to say that I would challenge that. I don't think that's a biblical point of view. I don't think God views the United States as better than any other country in the world. And then the second question to ask is, do you sort of instinctively lean on political leaders, political parties, political platforms as the means of renewal and restoration in a country? In other words, do you put your hope and your confidence in political solutions for spiritual problems? Um, this can sort of be seen in this view of, if we just get back to, 10 commandments and the courts and the prayer in the public schools, if we could just enshrine these values as the law of the land, then all of our problems would be fixed. Again, on what basis do you support that biblically? Like that, how do you avoid the fact that this tends to be a more behavior centered approach and enshrining values in as a sort of law of the land? That needs to be challenged, I think. Do you believe that instituting Christian morality, do you believe that either in law or in practice, Christian morality will save our culture, will fix it from all that's wrong? Do you tend to see yourself as an enemy, or do you tend to see those who disagree with you as enemies of Christianity, or your own personal sort of opponents or adversaries? Those are things I think to really ponder, to wrestle with, because scripturally, of course, Jesus Jesus simply doesn't take that approach. Yes, he draws lines. Of course, he recognizes truth and falsehood, and right and wrong and morality and so on. But Jesus' heart is is a mission to the world, and ultimately, it is not anything. It is not by enshrining values or morality into law that can really save us. So, what do you do? A few thoughts just of application. The first is this: I think we all need to guard ourselves against oversimplification. So, there are some of you watching this who may look at Christianity and you may just automatically equate it with a bunch of people who are Christian nationalists. You may assume that that's what all Christians are like, and I think you owe it to yourself and you owe it to others to do better than that. All the data doesn't support that. There are a lot of evangelical Christians. In fact, there are a lot of evangelical Christian leaders who have strongly and unequivocally renounced Christian nationalism. And so we've got to be more nuanced in our thinking on this, and we've got to guard ourselves against oversimplification. The second thing I think we need to do is guard against this mindset that would lump Christianity in with American identity. We have to be able to tease those two apart. It's one thing to be an American. It's another thing to be a Christian. And of course, there's a way to think Christian about your citizenship and about your national identity, but we really have to guard against fusing those two things together and recognize that they are different things. And then kind of related to that, that means that we have to learn to love our country, but reject the idolatry that would say it is our country that is superior and greater than everything else. Right? We can learn to love and appreciate the homeland that we have and the privileges and the freedoms that we enjoy, but we need to reject the approach that makes this into our idol. One of the ways that we can do this is by learning to be very, very honest about our failures and our shortcomings in terms of our national history. In other words, if we always feel like we have to cover up or gloss over the sins of the past or cultural weaknesses or our own shortcomings, that's a sign that probably we are trying to make an idol out of our country. I think as Christians, because our identity is not tied up to our national identity, because our identity is in something greater, we can actually be really honest. We can appreciate what is good, but we can also be honest about what is not good. And at the heart of it, what we all need to do, I think, is what's important to do is recognize that what we really need on a personal level and even on a national level goes much deeper than just a return to Christian values or Christian beliefs or Christian practices or something of that sort. What we really need is what only the gospel can deliver, which is changed hearts. So if you really are concerned about the way things are in the culture, then your job is to develop a passion for outreach and for evangelism, to share the good news of Jesus, who can bring the change that we really long for. Because it's only when hearts are changed that a culture begins to follow. And so if you're, if you're concerned about what you see in culture, all well and good, but don't fool yourself into thinking that if we just elect the right political leaders and if we just get the right party and the right platforms back in place, then everything will be fixed again. It's just not so. That's not the way it works. Instead, cultivate a heart for outreach, cultivate a love for Jesus that leads you to share Him with others. Thanks for watching. This has been a joint recording of Speaking of and the Cutting Room Floor. Don't forget, do me a favor and like and subscribe, and we will see you next time.